Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We look forward to having a very intimate and intense discussion on making regulatory reforms inclusive and sustainable. This is being jointly organized by SKOCH and CUTS International, two think tanks in their respective standing in the public policy space. We have with us Mr. Samir Kochar from SKOCH and Mr. Pradeep Mehta from CUTS International. Before I proceed to talk about the discussion, let me at this juncture invite Mr. Kochar for his brief comments. Samir, you have to unmute yourself.
I just want to take a minute to appreciate all the great work that CUTS have been doing over the years, and we are delighted to be a platform on which they have collaborated. Oftentimes, we find that in India, people have think tanks have very extreme positions in the sense they have very siloed view of things, and they like to talk to echo chambers. And oftentimes, in public policy or public affairs, progress is not made because you're talking only to like-minded people and not talking to people who oppose each other. Because it is only through negotiation and through a discussion and sharing of a common platform that progress can be made. Fortunately, we have been able to build SKOCH as an aggregation platform where all think tanks come, people with one point of view, people with another point of view, people with yet another point of view, and we try to help them talk to each other, negotiate in a congenial environment, document it, and try to make progress. So we are almost like a horizontal. We don't really deep dive into issues which are beyond our competence. And there we find that CUTS have been doing extremely good work in the regulatory space. We are wanting to learn from this collaboration. Inclusivity has been at the heart of what SKOCH has always done. And, we believe that unless and until the governance in India is participative and citizens' point of view is included, the development cannot take place. For many, many years, we've talked about and argued, and even Arun Mehra is here. Even in the erstwhile Planning Commission, we talked about bottom-up planning, and which was participatory, sort of panchayat level. You make a plan, and that goes to district, which goes to state, which goes to center. But it's unfortunately never been implemented. But now is as good a time as any in the face of the odds that the entire world is facing. I think not just planning, but regulation and everything else that the country does as in the field of governance need to become a lot more participative. With that, I welcome you all, and I'm looking forward to learning from this very enriching discussion.
Thank you, Samir. Just for the benefit of all the panelists and the participants in this roundtable, I'll try and explain as to what we are planning to achieve out of this discussion. The idea of regulatory reforms in India has become closely linked with ease of doing business. Several measures like reducing compliance burden, making it easier to start a business, hire, retrench, the large enterprises particularly. And, this is a universe which has captured the imagination. It has also been increasingly argued that the approach, particularly this one, has failed to consider concerns for informal entrepreneurs, small and medium enterprises, workers, citizens, who bear a disproportionate burden of our regulatory framework. Such worries in the current COVID-19 pandemic stage has only gained prominence, and it needs immediate attention. There is therefore a need to rethink on the approach towards regulatory reforms for making them inclusive as well as sustainable. How can this happen? The panacea to that is by making citizen well-being and sustainable progress as core objective of regulatory reforms and adopting a whole of government system approach towards design and implementation of such reforms. Towards this effect, an appeal has already been made in the form of a charter for nation's economic regulatory framework to the Office of the Prime Minister as well as Chief Ministers by CUTS International, supported by a whole a stakeholder group. Therefore, we would like to focus next 40 minutes of this discussion before we open for the Q&A and a discussion examines three different areas. A, how to make regulatory reforms inclusive and sustainable. B, how to institutionalize mechanisms for enabling governments to understand stakeholder concerns. And C, incentives and disincentives required in this regard. So in order to keep the discussion focused, my request to all the panelists, this discussion is going to be moderated by Mr. Mehta, to keep the comments within the framework so that at the end of the day, we are able to come up with a document which has got actionable recommendations to take it forward. Before I invite Mr. Mehta to take over, just a couple of housekeeping announcements here, that everybody will be muted. And unmuting is to be done by the speaker himself as and when the moderator asks him. This webinar is being recorded and is also being telecast live on all SKOCH group social media pages, which is Twitter, YouTube, as well as Facebook. So with this, I hand over the mic to Mr. Pradeep Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you, Gulsharan. You made my task much easier by introducing the topic that we had in mind. But just one process-related comment, that while I'm moderating, I would request your tech people not to mute me, because I have to then have to moderate the event in a way that things can move on faster than otherwise. Having said this, I mean, you have pointed out something which I'd just like to repeat, and this comes from very recent speech made by Prime Minister Modi at the India Ideas Summit at the US India Business Council this last week, where he also spoke about ease of doing business, and in the same breath spoke about ease of living. Now, when you say ease of living, Gulsharan, you have already captured many other things. But when we look at, as you have seen in our appeal, we're fortunate to have two of my fellow architects of this appeal, Arun Mehra and Ajay Shankar here, and therefore they will be able to add much more as to how we thought about this and how can we take it forward. Very rightly, I mean, if you find that the way our small entrepreneurs, micro entrepreneurs treated, it's quite a nightmare. A lot of the work which Rishi Agarwal is doing, some excellent work, and we're very pleased to have him here also, relates to large industries, medium-sized industries. But when it comes to small industries, it's really a nightmare quite often. And fortunately, and just to give an example, the government of Rajasthan has made life very easy for small and medium enterprises. If you want to start, for the first 3 years, there is no prior approval required. So you get rid of all the sort of prior approvals and so on. But having said that, I would like to reiterate the point which was made by Gulsharan is how can we make the reforms or regulatory reform more comprehensive, I would say, and not only sustainable and inclusive, by making the citizen well-being and sustainable progress as core objective of the regulatory reform, and adopting a whole of government approach. That is the other point. The trouble is that our government works in a very siloed manner, with the result that many things just don't move. If a shoe is pinching, the left shoe is pinching, the person who's responsible for the right shoe is not understanding what is happening with the left shoe. It's as bad as that. Now, the appeal has also been endorsed by many leading businessmen, and therefore we are happy to say that it's not just policy wonks like me or Samir who have signed on to it, many others as well. And we expect that this appeal will go further. We are constantly on the go, and we are happy to report, there's very little evidence, but the Prime Minister's office has taken our appeal quite seriously, as we gathered from our friends within the policy circles on Rasina Hill, as it were. With these brief remarks, and I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Amol Kulkarni, who's here, who has worked on it day and night, quite often day and night, to change the draft again and again on the basis of the various comments received by the initial group as well as some others that we consulted in this particular effort. Now, with these brief remarks, let me invite the panelists for the day. Given that we have 40 minutes for the discussion and another 10 minutes for the Q&A session, I would request the panelists to limit their thoughts for 8 to 10 minutes each. Rishi, let me start with you. You help companies manage compliances and keep a close tab on costs of running a business, particularly of small and medium enterprises. Can you throw some light on overlapping and recurring compliances and how do they burden the business? How could the situation be improved? And on the same lines, how do you think this translates into the ordinary living of a person, citizen? For example, getting a ration card or a driving license or a passport, etc. A lot of changes have happened. But at the same time, your learnings can easily be translated to what an ordinary citizen faces in life. Over to you. Rishi.
So, well, Mr. Mehta, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be a part of this elite panel today. We believe that what we cannot measure cannot be managed. So before I get to the specific answer of your question, let me point out that India's regulatory environment is really large and complex. There are too many acts, too many compliances, too many returns, too many registers, challans, too many dates, and too frequent regulatory updates. The ecosystem today has about 1,536 acts, 69,233 compliances, 6,618 different filings across central, state, and local laws across 28 states and 9 union territories. The complexity of compliance management for an Indian business grows exponentially from a few handful of acts to a few hundred compliances to several hundred acts and several thousand compliances as you move from a single location, single entity organization to a multi-business, multi-entity and multi-locational organization. Now, we talked about the specifics of how complex and ambiguous our regulatory environment is. I'll give you some examples. There are about 900 different permutations and combinations just for minimum wages in the state of Karnataka. Now, imagine across 3 zones, 4 skill levels, and 72 scheduled jobs, there are about 900 different permutations. Employee, as a definition, one would assume that it's a simple definition, but employee is defined differently in 16 different acts in the country. Wages are defined differently in 13 different acts in the country. Muster rolls, which is a simple attendance register, needs to be maintained in 10 different acts, in 10 different formats. The BOCW, which is Building and Other Construction Workers, Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, Factories Act, Minimum Wages Act, Payment of Wages Act, National Festival Acts. So there are different formats for some of these. Accident register, as simple as accident register, is required to be maintained at least in 4 acts. ESIC, Factories Act, Workmen Compensation Act, and so on. Permissible overtime varies from state to state. The daily, weekly, and quarterly levels are different for each other. There are different number of holidays required by law in different states. Earned leave, sick leave, casual leave, national and festival holidays leave. There are 3,000 regulatory changes that happen to environment in a year. These changes are published on 2,233 websites in multiple different languages. There is no simple way. Where I'm going, Mr. Mehta, is there are 63 million enterprises in the country. And believe it or not, there are only 1 million who are formal enterprises who pay social security, out of which only half of them, which is 500,000 of them, are actually actively paying social security. Only 12 million pay GST, out of which only 70,000 have a turnover of 5 crores and more. So you can imagine that there's something not right with the environment that we have created. We incentivize remaining ultra small, informal, whereas time and again, it has been proven that formal employers are far more resilient. They have access to institutional capital. They have access to better productivity tools and better mechanization. They improve productivity and hence improve wages. And in my opinion, this is a real problem. The number of compliances are just way too high. We really need to start thinking about it, create a compliance commission in the country, and work with a very focused 90 to 180 day reform agenda where we need to slash it by at least 50 to 75%. There's no need to have so many acts and compliances in a country like ours.
That was an excellent opening, except that the point which I had asked you was, so only the other day we were doing a webinar on labor sector reforms, labor law reforms, etc. And what came out from a very leading trade union activist, and this is again a part of the root problem here, is that we require bureaucratic reforms in order to change many of these things, and that is not happening. Bureaucracy tends to, as Manish Sabharwal says, that what is not permitted is prohibited. It's the kind of mantra which follows is very peculiar. I forgot to thank Samir for his welcome remarks. In terms of, we are very delighted to be partnering with SKOCH Foundation, who we think has been doing a splendid job for many years, and I've been on that platform many times. And in fact, this particular event is a part of a series that we'll be doing together, ending in a major conference sometime in September. Having said that, may I turn to Mrs. Fukan. You have set up 2 companies in travel and tourism sector and work closely with women entrepreneurs across the country as president of the FICCI Ladies Organization. From your experience, can you highlight challenges faced by women particularly and other entrepreneurs in navigating the regulatory maze and getting their voices heard by the government? Do you think digitalization can solve a lot of these problems? How do you propose to bridge the gap between policymakers and small entrepreneurs? Over to you. 8 to 10 minutes, please. Deepak.
I'm trying to unmute.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you for having me here. And thank you for wanting to listen to the other half of the population. In a country of 1.3 billion, 49% are women, but we find that there's only 8 million entrepreneurs who are women out of male entrepreneurs, about 50%, over 50% are male. So in those circumstances, and the fact that we do see in the economic survey of 2020 that 60% of India's women are still at home. They do unpaid labor and they do household work, but they're not being taken into the value chain. So we at FICCI work at 3 levels. Where we talk about women's inclusive growth, we're looking at the grassroots, the urban sector, and the corporate sector. And everywhere, the government is doing its best to pull up the women, but like we've all are discussing here, the regulatory maze is there. But let's talk about the positive news first. That with all the help of the government, we have a larger amount of women in startups. I think as per, they're about close to 38% are, about 50% of women entrepreneurs started their businesses at the age of about 25 to 30. And about 71% of women employing more women now, 5% or less or more people in it. And about 73% of women entrepreneurs are reporting a revenue about 10 lakhs. But largely, we can see that women have a very small, they're mainly in the micro entrepreneurs. We've been told that if you add About 14% of the business establishments in India are female entrepreneurs. That means 8 million out of the total of 58.5 million entrepreneurs. And the problems which have been there in the regulatory maze that we are talking about and how to navigate it, the challenges have always been, but are getting mitigated. But the standard challenges are what we've been spoken about by the previous speakers: registration of companies, the tax compliances, trying to get the knowledge, cobble the knowledge together about all the incentives that exist in the MSME startup ecosystem, in the SME sectors. There is information, there is a lot of schemes around there, but there is still a mismatch. It's still not connecting. Women need good legal support. The banking scenario, we all know that there is a collateral-free loan for women, still difficult to access. Women can't show they can't show property in their own name, but the government has worked towards that on paper. But there is that big challenge. And the others are the usual market linkages, which have failed, lack of organizational skills for women. They need more tools to financial and digital literacy. And women have also suffered from, traditionally, from the poor support systems, that they need a reliable care economy to be able to go out and work, hence India's statistics. Women need more health and business insurance plans. Women need to build the network. They need incubation for the ideas and the new startup horizon, and they need more mentorship. So from FLOW, from the organization that 36 years today, and I'm the 37th national president, we have been taking cognizance of this over the years, and we're working at different platforms. We have spoken to the government on the key issues which are right now in COVID times, looking at the sustainable livelihoods which are impacting women. We are not going into the whole, the gamut, but the key COVID impact analysis that requires to be done for our industry are where women are involved: agriculture, handloom, handicraft, and the small businesses, micro, nano enterprises, and the tourism, that sector that I belong to. We find that there are schemes aplenty, but like I said, the mismatch is the problem. So from us as a body for Women's Chamber, we are trying to bridge this and bring it to the government. We've been in touch with talking to the petroleum minister and asking for women-led enterprises to be given reservation in their in the rural state, urban, in the fuel stations that they have across the country. If they can give that outlet, which would help the NRLM as well to come in, National Rural Livelihood Mission. The whole problem everywhere we find is the market linkage. So if they have this outlet and women would help the other women, connect them through these fuel stations, outlets across the country, and be able to sell their produce, manage their work there. And we've asking for reservation for women in the distribution of the LPG, of CNG, where they're allowing the buying on the distributorship, and to be able to train them further in the deliveries and the training. The ministry had spoken about the Ujjwala Didis, what they call the beneficiaries, which I thought interesting. When they gave out the free gas cylinders to the women, they also created an army of women who were there as the Ujjwala Didis, who could go home to home, help them with the gas installation, help them to do the technical, the upkeep of the cylinders, speak to the women of the house. And yeah, so that was another thing. So we at FLOW are also trying to, in our way, in the rural sector, adopt a village each. Out of my 17 chapters on the country.
Can I ask you a very specific targeted question?
All right.
You find that, in dealing with the regulatory maze, women's are they discriminated against, or is there a separate treatment meted out to women entrepreneurs? I'll give you an example. This happened in Lucknow. A young lady entrepreneur was sanctioned a loan of 5 lakh rupees under the Mudra Yojana.
Yes.
And the manager said, I will only disburse the loan when you give me 50,000 rupees. And she was crying when she was narrating the story to me. I'm giving an example.
Yes.
This could have happened even if she was not a woman.
Exactly.
It has happened. This is one serious problem in our country is corruption. And
but that's a 70-year-old history behind it. So that's what I would like to address it with a bit of optimism, because I'm sitting in
we are running out of time, actually.
All right. So quickly to tell you about the tourism industry, which I also come from. And the government has expanded the ambit of MSME to now include the services sector as well. So manufacturing and services sector has been broadened under MSME. So in the tourism sector, about some 30% are still out of the net because they are still not qualifying. So for that, I would urge the government that, and as the government of Assam asked for all the tourism stakeholders to give them the data of their direct employees that they have in their companies. That was given to them. But we understand in Bangladesh, they gave 2,000 rupees per month directly into the bank accounts of the employees. That also helped them to survive all these months of shutdown. But that hasn't been the same here.
Thank you very much.
That's something they should take note of.
Thank you very much. We have to move on.
Yes.
Very good, excellent remarks. Over to Ajay Shankar. Ajay has been in the government, worked closely with policymakers in designing regulatory frameworks, and have also chaired an expert committee on the subject with whom we had interacted. Where do you think we have fallen short or failed in designing an inclusive, comprehensive, and sustainable regulatory framework which can take into account all stakeholders, particularly the workers, small and informal entrepreneurs? How do you think we can move from here? One important issue which came up, Ajay, the other day is the disrespect of workers. You know, there is very little respect to workers. But that, of course, is not a regulatory issue, except it's an issue of a behavioral issue of industrialists. Over to you,
Ajay. Thank you, and I must compliment you for widening the canvas of the discussion beyond ease of doing business to also include ease of living. A couple of preliminary points. One is that regulations emerge from laws or from government programs. And on both, we have an excess, as was pointed out so well by the first panelist. There is a particular history of colonial administration and administration of the last so many years, where all wisdom resides in those who wield power or hold office. And the process of consultation with stakeholders has been weak, historically very weak. It has improved, but it is still quite weak. In the expert committee, which I headed, echoed what has been one of your passions and missions for many years, is the regulatory impact assessment. Now, there is lip service to it, but I have yet to see the process getting actually in motion in some meaningful fashion. And part of the problem, in addition to the problem of bureaucratic attitudes, is that this work is not glamorous. There is a lot of crossing of T's and dotting of I's that has to be done. And people who are looking at success in the short run and recognition, both civil servants and political leaders, this doesn't seem to fit into that incentive matrix of something dramatic which shows them in a good light. How difficult the situation is, I would highlight by one recommendation that was there in our report, and which is that we need a Wikipedia kind of process to just put in the public domain all the rules and regulations that exist. Because I discovered that ministries couldn't give me a decent inventory, and nor could big businesses, because somebody lower down the hierarchy would handle this, and they didn't quite know all the number of rules and regulations and compliances that that firm had to deal with. So one of the strange recommendations, I never thought I'd make a recommendation of this kind, is that we need an open source Wikipedia type of platform where we get incremental wisdom about the number of regulations that are there. Now, how to make the process of regulatory reform inclusive and effective? I think we need a separate institution within the state government and the central government whose only mandate is to work on regulatory reform. Because the moment they have some other mandate, they can easily show success there, and this will get neglected. But if I, as an individual, as a leader of an advisory body or a state commission or whatever, if my only mandate is regulatory reform, then after 6 months, 1 year, if I want to claim credit, I must have some concrete results to show. If not in terms of actual decisions, then at least a wish list before government which is specific. Because one problem that is there is that a wish list which is specific and detailed doesn't quite exist in most sectors. So we have a challenge to create that. And the other challenge is for us, those in civil society, to go down and create domain capacity or do a deep dive and say, okay, here are the changes that you need. And this is our wish list for a municipal level, or in the tourism sector, or in the hospitality sector, or for restaurants or small medium enterprises. And we keep saying, these are 30, 40 points, please do it. And I'm sure sooner or later we will get some success. The other problem, and which was, I'm glad, highlighted, and that is very important, is that all the reform discussion is from the point of view of those who are relatively privileged. So big business and so on and so forth. The person at the bottom of the pyramid, he is not a real stakeholder as yet in most processes in India. And therefore, he's also not a stakeholder or a participant in the discussion of regulatory reform. So if you look at the recent crisis on migrant labor, some things came up which should have come up a long time back. Like one of the reforms announced by government after extreme stress is that there should be portability of the ration card. And in the digital process, it should not be difficult. If I have a ration card from village somewhere, if I go to any city, I should be able to use it. Now, this should have occurred to people years ago, and it should have been part of the whole digitization program of the government. But it needed this extreme human stress for this issue to get highlighted and the logical decision to get taken. So those who are at the bottom of the pyramid have no voice. And they're also not organized to think or have voices. So I think the responsibility on people like us in civil society is a bit higher to engage with them and think on their behalf and articulate their needs and get their buy-in on that. I mean, a lot of people have done very good work in the handicraft and handloom sector and artisanal sector, and there some wish list does emerge from NGOs that please do this, and life would be much better. But at the bottom of the pyramid, in terms of the urban worker, the micro enterprises, the self-employed, those who are street vendors or those who are trying to do something in the lower areas, the voice is very weak. And then the voice from the point of view of citizens and the ease of living, that voice is even weaker. So if I were to take just one example, air pollution in Delhi is so bad that we have a health emergency and we are being criminal to ourselves. But the articulation that this is a crisis, that these are the facts, we need to do something, has been surprisingly weak. And so because of that weakness, we have a government program which talks of an action plan, not a mission, and talks only of 25-30% reduction in air pollution, rather than saying that in 5 years we'll get clean air. So on the environmental side, all of us pay a very high price. but the articulation of civil society is not there. And if the articulation is good enough, we will present before political leaders and ourselves as citizens the trade-off between money. Do you spend so much money on air pollution, or do you spend so much money on flyovers? So that kind of discussion will become much better if some more detailed work takes place.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is, the point which you're making is something which our elected representatives should be engaged in. The councillor, the punch, etc., including MLAs. It's not, you don't have to go to an MP. But what we do find is that the political machinery has also become so uncared. They only come at the time of vote to come and talk to the people. I'll give you a small example. There is a gardener in my colony who comes from Bihar, and he could not get a cylinder under the Ujjwala Yojana because his Aadhaar card was there from Bihar. Now that doesn't stop him from proving his point that he's here. But this is how it is. So until I could help him, but otherwise he was burning firewood all the time. I'll just give you one small example as to how officials treat them.
And I will end because there are 3 questions. So the last one I would like to also address, which is incentives and disincentives. So now we have rankings of the World Bank on ease of doing business. Now Niti Aayog has become very fond of ranking people on all kinds of indicators and competition of states. So if as civil society we could generate a matrix by which we could rank people and go public, that on regulatory reform, these are parameters, this is how you are faring, we are open to correction, maybe we've done injustice to you, we're not being fair. But when it comes into the public domain, then the problem of the MLA and the MP and the minister taking it seriously will, to some extent, start getting addressed. Because I would not like, say, as Rajasthan or our government in Delhi, to be at the bottom of some ranking on regulatory reform. I'd like to be somewhere on top. I may game the system, I may do cosmetic things, but at least I'll start paying attention to it. Today, nobody pays attention.
Thank you very much. I think the very important point which you made about having a body dedicated to regulatory reforms at the center and states, this is something which we had recommended under Arun Maira's leadership.
So had our expert.
Yeah, also. Yeah. No, I know. I'm coming to Arun Maira, so I'm just trying to draw a linkage between what you said and what we had done under the leadership of Arun Maira when he was member of the Planning Commission. They developed a national manufacturing plan, and there was a separate big section on business regulatory reforms, including the recommendation that state level and central level bodies should be set up. Now, of course, we have since evolved with that, and we are now request Arun to tell us that how difficult it is to make different government departments to listen to each other and work with stakeholders. You have written excellent books also. Yet you have called for a whole of government systems approach to regulatory reforms. How do you think this approach can be implemented? Why would different government departments come on board? What incentives and or disincentives do we require to make this happen? Over to you, Arun.
Well, thank you very much, Pradeep, and thank you. And Samir, it's a pleasure to be with you and Gursharan. Your seminars have always, when I've been able to attend them, given me a lot of food for thought. And Samir, I've also enjoyed just very good food also with you. So I'm missing all that. And Pradeep, thank you for setting this up. Yes, Pradeep, I did, in the time I was in the Planning Commission, delve very deeply into these questions about the process of devising the required regulations. And then the question comes of the purpose of the regulations. And so here we are, many years later, still saying that we haven't been able to do it. So I've reflected on why not. But I must note that there's a change of seasons, a change of paradigms underway. And my favorite poet, Robert Frost, has a lovely poem about the change of seasons in Boston, where I lived many years, where he says in the month of April, when you think you moved from winter into spring, suddenly there's a snowfall again, and you're not sure whether you're still in winter or you have got into spring. I'm noticing in the last few months, especially because of the pandemic, but even before that, for a few years, since particularly the financial crisis, that there were signs of a new season and that the old season might pass. The Prime Minister's speech that you have referred us to is one indication. It's like maybe there will be a new season now, where he has put right up front on the top that ease of living must be at the same level as ease of doing business. So that's very good for once, that rather than as usually the platitudes were, let's focus on ease of doing business, and somewhere at the back, we hope that it will also help to improve the lives of and livelihoods of people. So he's put it alongside, but then in the same speech, he talks about what he's celebrating, that, we moved up so many ranks on a very flawed measurement, as Ajay pointed out, of ease of doing business. So if we are, as Gursharan said at the beginning, we manage what we measure. If what we are measuring is the wrong thing, and we are being very smart as managers and economists and bureaucrats in devising, methods and policies towards improving the wrong thing, and I'm just for the sake of saying that the paradigm shift that improving ease of business as the goal is the wrong thing. Prime Minister himself says, let's talk about ease of living. And this brings me to the very important points that Gurshan, you asked us to concentrate on, is how to institutionalize processes for understanding stakeholders. And this is what I find is the problem. It's not just with the bureaucrats, mind you, it is with our think tanks also. The processes that we use are not designed to really listen to people who talk about other things than we think are important. And they talk not in numbers perhaps, and they talk in phrases which don't seem educated to us. But that is what we have to develop processes for, to listen, to deeply listen to, especially those who have been marginalized in the policy space, and also, as we can now see, in the economic development process the last few years. So I want to talk about that there is also, I noticed, a shifting of seasons within the processes of policy making, the so-called science of policy making and economics, that economists themselves are questioning that do they have the science to really understand the world? They made it too scientific from their perspective, too much based on numbers. And if it's based on numbers, then it will be focused on those things that they can find numbers for, and not those things which are fuzzy, like I say, what is well-being? What is ease of living? And whose ease of living? It's not the business person's ease of living we're talking about. We're talking about the people who may not be in business at all, have no chance of being in business, the citizens of the country. So there is their voices, and what language do they speak? What are the numbers we should be looking at? Unless I'm going to say, the policymakers stop asking the think tanks to give them good scientific studies of the problem, we will not change how policy is made and how it needs to be made to really improve the well-being of citizens and the quality of the environment in the country. I was just reading just this morning a book written by Mervyn King, the former governor of the bank in the UK, and another economist. And they point out that the best strategy advice that they have seen reading business strategy books and policy strategy books is one which says is that the first thing that you must ask before you design a strategy is to understand what is going on. And that what is going on means you open your mind and just walk around, as it were, listen to many things to understand what is going on before you even know what is the real problem that needs to be addressed with some scientific solution. So we don't design our think tank processes, nor, as I'm saying, our policy making process, and they go hand in hand, to really listen to a variety of stakeholders within a situation on the ground to see what matters there and what is going on over there. I'm going to come back to request both Sameer and yourself, Pradeep, because you have a role to play at this time in India. You are both Indian think tanks, and as Sameer said, he has always been saying, I don't take a stance, whether it's favoring trade or favoring labor laws or favoring something. Bring people together to put many perspectives together to see the whole beast, as it were, the whole government's requirement to solve, and put that together. And Pradeep, you, I know, have been getting to the ground and to hear the voices on the ground to do this. So there is an opportunity for us in India to create a competency to deliver against what I'm very fearful of. We can create those cells, like we've asked, and Ajay's asked, and we had asked Pradeep earlier, in the state governments and even in the center to focus on regulatory reform. But if they are going to do regulatory reform the same old ways that we think policies should be made, or the environment first understood, we'll make a mess, a further mess. So we have to improve ourselves and orient ourselves to help those bodies, if they are so created within the governments. Hearing Ms. Fukan, I thank you for being one woman here and hearing you. What you said again touches me. See, as you said, there's so few women in the participation in the policies. It's all a man's world, as it seemed. But I was making a metaphysical thought came to my mind, and economic development for the last since the Industrial Revolution, particularly, has been about distorting nature to fit it into machines. Distort nature to fit it into machines. And in the policy space, we have been too much trying to distort the informal sector to fit it into our formal sector. Okay, we are distorting reality to make it suit us. Thirdly, the whole feminist movement, and I've said this in at least in CI at their forum, and I could happily say it in FICCI, that we men are asking women to distort themselves to fit into our man's world. Learn what we do and be as smart as we are. The time has come to put, let me say these three things: nature, women, and informality. That is the real world, and that is a world which sustains itself inclusively. So on the other side, we've got the formality, the men, and the machines. The paradigm has to shift. And we must listen far more to women talking about life. Women give life. Men go to business. So when you talk of ease of doing business versus ease of living, I think men will tell you about ease of doing business. And please look at, and here I might say, Fukan, I want to listen to the woman at home. But that is where ease of living is, not the entrepreneur. So she'll again talk about the ease of doing business. I want to know about the woman. She creates life. She is nurturing family, right? What does she need? And then from that derive what would be policies for small enterprises and businesses, as well as then the larger policies that we may wish to have and need to have to make this whole system oriented towards, as I said, the ease of a mother producing and bringing up children. That's ease of living.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. That was, again, a very excellent intervention. Now, I have a question from from one of the participants. I mean, there are many law commission reports and other governmental reports like the committee that we were talking about, headed by Ajay or Arun, etc. How is it that we could, sort of garner all the recommendations and put them forward for implementation? Administrative Reforms Commission, for example. Arun, over to you.
Exactly. You see, as Ajay pointed out, that we don't seem to be paying attention to, as you said, the process of reforming and bringing many things in government together. We had an Administrative Reforms Commission with Veerappa Moily as the chairman, which spent 3 years. They went to every state. They met with every political party across the spectrum. They produced these set of reports. And when I was in the planning commission, I said, okay, we must reform. The first thing when we want to do something, we want to set up another commission. I said, no, before we do that, if someone has done some work quite recently, let's read it and study it and ask them the challenges they encountered in getting the whole idea of administrative reforms accepted. So here was the point where Veerappa Moily said that, look, We have done this after so much effort. The Prime Minister, then Manmohan Singh, has hardly called us to have a meeting with the whole cabinet. So what do we do about administrative reforms? At that time, and I just joined the Planning Commission also, the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had asked the Planning Commission one evening to give a note about the 10 most important reforms to make to get the economy going and inclusive growth. So it was done apparently within 3 or 4 hours. He asked it immediately for some meeting. So just as it was to go out of the door, Montek asked me, hey, Arun, we're sending this note. Do you have any thoughts? I looked at it. There were 10 things mentioned. 9 of them were to do with financial sector reforms and banking sector reforms. If that's all that we focus on, and that will solve the problems of the world. And please keep noticing that I'm saying again, the administrative reforms, even since then, you and I have asked, please pay attention to this. Does it ever receive attention? And I'm saying it's about the economists again and the policymakers. They're glorifying the financial economy and the big business economy. And thus we will not get attention to these other, as Ajay says, softer things, but they're the essential things. So what are we going to do? I'm asking you and Sameer, please spend less time on banking sector and financial sector reforms. Your energy is precious to us. Please use 100% of it for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Arun, I've heard you very clearly. Rishi Agarwal, the last word to you.
Please go ahead, sir.
Rishi, would you like to comment before we conclude?
So, sir, where we come from, we look at regulatory compliance, which affects micro, small, medium, and large enterprises. Unfortunately, anybody who's informal today, from a regulatory compliance perspective, the load is almost not there because they are informal. There is no ESI, PF, PT, LWF, or any other labor law. There's no direct tax. There's no indirect tax. And I would like to submit that that's one reason why they continue to stay small. They never are able to grow. They continue to languish in poverty because they don't have access to institutional capital. They continue to stay less productive and so on. India has always had this 8% or so unemployment rate since independence. So that hasn't changed a lot. India doesn't have a jobs problem. It has a wages problem, and wages are directly related to productivity. So we submit that in order for India to go on ease of living, people have to start making more money than they make. And that will not happen until, out of the 63 million enterprises that we have, the number of formal enterprise go from 1 million to 10 million. And that's where they'll be more resilient. There'll be access to institutional capital. They'll have more productivity, more tools, more training. Crisis like COVID, they will respond and recover better. And to that extent, in order to incentivize companies to grow, my submission is that we need to take a look at these 69,233 compliances, and with a flick of a pen, ask ministries and departments to look at cutting them into half. And it's possible. There's so much duplication out there. We definitely think it's feasible, it's possible. And if we can build Aadhaar, Setu app in less than 15 days, if we put our mind to it, we can go ahead, reform it, digitize it, and significantly improve the ease of living in this country by improving ease of doing business and promoting formal enterprises.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ajay, you were asking for where could you find a repository of all the compliances and so on. Here it is, being done by Rishi under the leadership of Manish Agarwal. It's all there, and they do it technologically. It's not manually, otherwise it would be impossible.
I'm so glad to hear that, because
yeah.
this is
but we didn't know when you were running that committee. I didn't know.
But again, the point is that those who are experiencing the burden or this regulatory framework or this regulatory compliance requirement, their voices need to be heard, articulated, and carried to decision makers. And my own view is that 50-60% no, but we need to probably get rid of 90% of what is there on the statute. It's because you see, we have settled into an equilibrium where those who have to enforce regulations are very happy because the space it has created for rent seeking or corruption or harassment is huge. And if you look at this awfully tragic incident which happened in Tamil Nadu recently, where two people died in police custody.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly there was this regulatory violation that probably the shop was being run where it should not be run, because all roadside shops in India are being run illegally because none of them have formal permissions. As having handled this business of unauthorized construction, I had this conversation with a very wise boss who said, well, Ajay, you are right, unauthorized construction must go, but do you really want to demolish 2/3 of the city of Delhi then?
Thank you very much. Janavi, Ms. Fukan, last word to you. Arun spoke a lot about the issue that you had raised. And would you like to respond as your last words?
I certainly would. And thank you very much, Mr. Maitra, for taking cognizance of the other half who hold up half the sky. I leave you with another industry that I come from, the handloom industry. Because this is the informal, the disorganized sector which is sustaining this country. It is the rural economy that is still feeding us now in COVID times, especially in Assam in the flood times. So, gentlemen, look at this. 90% of the world's handlooms come from India. This sector employs 1 crore Indians, largest number after agriculture. And 72% of this are women. And in my own state of Assam, we have the highest weaver households in the country at almost 10.9 lakh households. Out of this also, 77% are women. Yet they are struggling in this ecosystem. Now with the flood in COVID times, there were no sales. They are literally out on the streets. In floods, they're even worse. But some states have done much better than us. So we are the largest weaver households, is where they've been more organized under the corporate societies, like Goa, Kerala, for instance. So the government needs to do way more for this. There are lots of, there are a lot of schemes on paper, but it's still not a connect. I think it's a time for the nano enterprises to come up. In the end of the day, all the self-help groups which have been created under NRLM and SRLM, the state ones, the market access is a problem. Now with COVID and the floods, we don't know where they will sell, where they will go. And this is the time when the backward and the forward integration has to come from the entrepreneurs. And I do see in the rural economy, there are more startups coming up, in the IT as well. People are concentrating on rural ideas. Hopefully this is going to be the engine of growth, and very positive that it'd be sustainable livelihoods for women, which will really hold us going. And from Fiki Flow, we've tried to work on this. So we've consulted with a Dutch consulting agency and working with women-led enterprises in all our chapters in the country, that wherever there are such enterprises, to help them scale up. So women can survive there. In my own state of Assam, with the Areca nut machinery, which creates the biodegradable plates, are being exported now. And that's also giving an income to women in different areas. So maybe we all have to, with the migrant labor, people going back to the small towns and villages, this is what we are still, everyone out of that whole network of the regulatory maze that you're talking about. Gentlemen, there's a whole lot world left behind. And believe me, they're on their own and they're struggling to get there. That is what we are looking at.
Thank you very much. There are two important issues raised by the participants. One is, can we suggest that every law must have a regulatory impact assessment annually? That could be done by the think tanks or Niti Aayog. I think that is something which we have recommended on a regular basis. In fact, not only that, we have also recommended a sunset clause in our laws, that unless they are revalidated, the law extinguishes. We don't seem to move anywhere. Now, an important point which has been made by one of the participants is that what is it that we can sell to politicians in terms of what's in it for me, in terms of regulatory reforms? How is it, so that we are able to get the politicians' attention and to push forward the regulatory reform agenda? That I think is very crucial. And how is it that we can do it? So would any of the panelists like to respond before we close the discussion? Arun, please.
Thank you. The political system is, let's use a big, broad word, corrupt. The structures of it are corrupt. I mean, Shashi Tharoor has written an article this morning saying that we should get the presidential system, the parliamentary system has failed us. It's not just here. The parliamentary system requires political parties require to get themselves elected, they require to have funds. It's in the structure of the beast. So our appealing to that structure to say, do what we are offering you, the incentive is, I hope it's going to enable me to succeed in that structure, to get elected, to get more money, and so on. So I'm realizing in the last few years, since leaving the Planning Commission, spending my time with people like yourself, but much more, people in the civil society space. Change in embedded power structures come from outside the power structures. So our trying to appeal to that structure to adopt these new ideas, it's a losing game. You have to put pressure on it. And yes, your ideas pressure, you're putting, both of you, Sameer and yourself and others too. But that has to be supported by civil society. And I know, Pradeep, I'm with you and you keep on doing this. Your origin was consumers support what you say. So don't too quickly start to put your idea before the politician to say this may be good for you. Spend a lot more time to get the civil society to say this man and these ideas are our ideas. Then the politicians have to pay attention, as we're finding everywhere, because they have to then go with it. So it's for yourselves, I'm saying. I think the time has come for good think tanks in the country who are saying we want to change the basic structures, like you're saying, how reforms are made, for example, and that the bureaucratic system should be more effective than it is. You cannot ask, like we're trying all the time to tell bureaucrats to change their system. They've got a vested interest to keep it like it is. So unless there's much more pressure from outside the establishment, it will not change. So the language, again, I come back to that, the engagement of people in the reforms is how you're going to get their support. They know that you're listening to them. ये तो हमारी सुनते हैं, तो ये जो कहेंगे, तो हम उनके पीछे हैं. हाँ, पर आप उनकी सुनते हैं कि नहीं सुनते हैं? And many people are asking this, who are these damn think tanks who are speaking on our behalf? Have they ever asked our permission to speak on our behalf? Do they even know what our life is?
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, we come to an end to this very interesting roundtable. And as I said earlier, that this is, thank you. And this is going to be part of a series. This is the first of the series, and I'm glad that we had an excellent discussion. And I must thank each of you participants personally, but there is a formal vote of thanks to be done by Rohan Kocher and Amol Kulkarni from CUTS, Rohan from SKOCH Foundation. And let me hand over to Rohan. Rohan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mehta. At the outset, I'd like to congratulate you on what I thought was a fascinating panel discussion, starting off with Mr. Agarwal, who explained this complex cobweb of compliances that we have to deal with in India, going over to Ms. Fukan, who spoke to us specifically about the challenges in terms of support systems and lack of access to care economy and sustainable livelihoods which women face. Mr. Ajay Shankar, who spoke to us extensively about how political and bureaucratic incentives are misaligned for extensive regulatory reform. And he said that there is a narrative capture of the reform process by the privileged, and therefore we must look at the bottom of the pyramid, which needs greater representation. And your observation here, Mr. Mehta, was actually quite interesting, where you said that only at the time of voting will they be heard. And I think the call that you have issued for regulatory reform is not just a call for regulatory reform, it's one for rethinking of the social contract and how democratic assets can be made more liquid and more responsive to social problems. And this is also where Mr. Myra, with his observations about processes and regulations and purpose, came in and said that should we be measuring what we are measuring, and should the process for all stakeholders be similar? How do we listen more to the marginalized? And I must say that since an early age, ever since I was an intern at the Planning Commission, perhaps, I've looked up to Mr. Myra, and I've also looked up to the fact that Indian policy making is so vast and diverse that we must bring our perspectives, and everyone at SKOCH, at least every employee, spends a particular amount of time every year at the grassroots to try and understand what the last mile issues are and spend time with societies that are marginalized to understand the on-ground impact of what's happening. I must congratulate CUTS for what I think is a fantastic initiative which they're undertaking, and thank you very much to each and every panelist that came here today and enriched all of us with your inputs. Thank you very much.
Amol Kulkarni.
Yes, thank you very much. And let me thank all the panelists and the participants on behalf of CUTS International to attend this seminar and for some valued thoughts which have been made, particularly with respect to listening or different stakeholders and the process of listening. We assure you that we are not only talking about creating structures and bodies like Regulatory Reform Commission, but we are also trying to work towards building capacity for listening. For instance, we have done a lot of work on regulatory impact assessment to build awareness and advocacy and generate evidence of value of regulatory impact assessment of different regulations. In addition to that, and as has been also explained by Mr. Mehta in the appeal that has recently been issued, we have issued a call for a three-step test for testing regulations. The first step is to test whether regulations are legal, for instance, whether they have any statutory backing, whether they are necessary, would they be achieving their objectives, and are they proportional? And for instance, the proportionality test is not just for formal enterprises, but also for women, marginalized and informal groups. We believe that this institutionalizing these processes can help in listening better and listening more to people who have been marginalized and have faced disadvantaged of the regulatory system. And we have pursued different state governments and central government to institutionalize such mechanisms, and we promise to work more in this regard. With that words, thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Gursharan. We can close the meeting.
Yes, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this morning and making this discussion extremely valuable. Because when we talk in terms of policy, 1, 2, 3 discussions may not be enough. This is always a journey which pushes the agenda from point A to point B. And that precisely is the objective of organizing this series of roundtables in association with CUTS International. It's a very, very valuable initiative. And at the end of not only each of the discussions, but also the distillate that we arrive at the end of the series, I'm sure it's going to lead the way for a whole lot of stuff to be followed up in future and making the regulatory reforms viable and acceptable. Thank you very much once again, and see you soon.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Goodbye.